Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time Scarlet Woman.
And I'm the Warrior Witch Nike, folk witch and astrologer.
And welcome to the Darling YouTube channel, a channel where we discuss magic, mysticism, religion, the occult, esoterica, and much more. And today I have a special guest, me! Nike is my podcast co-host of Occultism with a Side of Salt, and I'm so happy to have visited them. It makes me very happy. And I thought it'd be nice for us to discuss the difference between ceremonial magic and folk magic and how to know which is right for you. On my channel, I talk pretty much entirely about ceremonial magic, though I've covered certain things like tarot and witchcraft in the past. I thought it would be nice to bring someone on who practices the other side to help, you know, new seekers decide like which path is actually right for them. So we're going to be discussing like why we chose our path, how they look different, whether you can blend the two, and all those exciting things.
The fun things.
The fun things. Yes. So first, I think we should just kind of explain like what our practices kind of look like. For me, if you're on the channel, you probably know who I am, but you may not. You may have come from their channel. So I'm a Thelemite. I practice ceremonial magic very much in line of things like Hermeticism, modern Western ceremonial magic. I incorporate some Hermetic Kabbalah, all sorts of things. I'm very classically Thelemic, though I am solitary, which is a little different than a lot of Thelemites. But I practice a very sort of Thelemic path. I do a lot of ritual work. I do daily ritual work. I read a lot. I do a lot of prayer and like spirit work. Not much of my practice is devoid from spirit contact, which I think is one of the big gaps that we're going to see probably between the two of our practices, because I practice a very religious, non-secular form of occultism. Also, something that I think people get confused is like all magic equals witchcraft, when that's not really the truth. I would not consider myself a witch. Would you call yourself a witch?
Yeah, I call myself a witch. Also, if you've come from my channel, I do have an interview with Georgina. If she decides to link it, it'd be up here. Otherwise, it's on my channel. So we've had the people on my channel should be at least somewhat familiar with you, I would hope. I call myself a witch. I'm also an astrologer. I'm not selling readings quite yet, but I keep getting asked to, so I should maybe do that. But I honestly do kind of disagree to a point, depending on the difference being mostly like that one is devoid of spirit work and the other is more entirely, because like with a lot of folk stuff, you're supposed to like get to know the spirit of the plant, you know, for your plant allies, or of stones or whatever you're using, or like the land spirits. Like I feel like if you're doing witchcraft, generally, not every practice, of course, it's not a blanket statement, but on the whole, it's I think both are very spirit related. It's just the way that you interact with spirits is going to be very different.
Yeah, like you guys don't really do as much invocation.
No, we don't do invocation. It's more like I'm going to get to know you one-on-one. Like I'll go out to my balcony and talk to my catnip plant, but it's not like I'm invoking the spirit of the catnip.
Yeah, which you can actually. This is something that's not talked about much, but Shulky talks about it. I think is really like the only author who really does. Like you actually can like invoke spirits of plants, though it's not a super common practice. Typically the spirits you see people working with in ceremonial magic are gods, demons, angels, stuff like that. Occasionally you'll see things like ancestors. Every once in a while you see stuff with the fae, but not normally. But it's typically like gods, angels, demons, and that stuff's the most common. What type of spirits do you see like folk practitioners working with?
I mean, like I mentioned, it's plants. If they choose to work with deities, most do, or at least online, most people seem to. Deities, ancestors are very, very common in folk magic. And depending on what kind of folk magic you're doing, it's very Christian based usually. So depending on exactly what, saints are very common, God, Jesus, the Virgin Mary. Yeah, I mean, plants, Christian spirits, ancestors, that kind of thing. And if you're doing something that's a folk magic thing that's not based in Christianity, that's going to come with its own pantheon of spirits and possibly gods.
Yeah, we have a pretty similar thing with the relationship to Christianity, because a lot of like Western ceremonial magic pulls from like Judaism, Christianity, and stuff like that. So you see that very strong Abrahamic influence. I think in folk magic they recognize that. In some spaces of the witch space, you see that kind of ignored, but typically people don't really disconnect them entirely. But in ceremonial magic there are practices that only use pagan stuff, like Thelema is pretty pagan, though not entirely. The PGM is completely pagan, like So you see there are some kind of more pagan-y ceremonial practice, but I think that's similar to folk.
Yeah, well, I mean, because, yeah, same thing. It depends on if they want to be fully Reconstructionist. So, like, what I have more experience with is the Norse and Hellenic stuff. So if you want to be entirely Reconstructionist from the old ways, you know, you don't work with any of the Christian stuff, you can do a slightly more modern version where they started to mix. Like, in Iceland, I believe, they started doing that, where basically, instead of converting entirely to Christianity, they, for a long time, were like, oh, okay, we'll just add them in. So, you know, I'll call on Thor and Freya and Jesus and, I don't remember if it was Beelzebub, maybe? Like, they were just, like, these are all now spirits I can call on. So if I need boosts from everybody, I'll call on everybody. And it's very interesting.
It's actually kind of similar to Thelema, because we're... well, some people consider Thelema pagan, some don't. I use the label because it's a little easier than explaining Thelema to every person I meet, because no one knows what that word means. But we also have that kind of weird blend of like pagan and Abrahamic stuff. I think a big misconception is that it's a hard dichotomy between paganism and Abrahamicism in general, when in reality the two pretty much, they influence each other, right? Because like modern Christianity, when it, you know, went through Europe, like a lot of pagan folk traditions remained in it. It took influence from various pagan rites, and modern paganism, like Wicca and stuff, have that lineage that connects it to Christianity. So it then again takes influence from Christianity. So it's really interesting how that kind of happened.
Well, and I don't know, granted, this is just like a rumor I've heard. I don't know if it's substantiated or not. I've heard that the sign of the cross was taken from people doing Thor's hammer.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It might be a lie. That might be a pagan lie, like the whole Yule is stolen stuff. But like, maybe. I at least think it's interesting that it can be. If it's not, if it was the sign of the cross first, it's interesting that it could be used to use it in like a pagan way. So it goes from the sign of the cross to the sign of Thor's hammer.
That's interesting, because in like Hermetic ceremonial magic, you see this thing called the Kabbalistic cross, but it's the placement is backwards. So it's Ata Malkut Vegebara Vegedala Leilam, which is like the reverse of how the Catholic one goes, but it's still a very similar gesture.
Interesting.
It's interesting to see how that gesture kind of survived through so many practices and traditions into the modern day. So what does like the average ritual or spell you do look like? Do you do rituals or do you do spells? What do you typically do? Like if you're trying to do a working or operation of some sort?
I think the difference is that, at least for me in my path, folk magic, I don't know that I would call them rituals, because I consider for myself rituals to be a lot more complicated, like doing a whole thing and casting the circle and calling the, like, I know that you call the watchtowers, I believe.
Yeah, I do that quite a bit.
Yeah. I don't do that. It's a lot more just like, now granted, I'm not trying to say I don't do any of the work, but the real basic overview of it is you kind of just like throw it all together and you say what you need to say. Sometimes there's like a prayer you say on top, or you ask your deities for assistance. You ask them to like grant you their power by their mercy or whatever. Sometimes it's because a lot of folk magic is a lot more just like the things that you do. It's not really like a ceremony thing. Like some of them are, you carry this nut in your pocket for protection and you rub it when you just like want to wake up the spirit a little bit. Like just real little things. So a lot of what folk magic does is not like a whole thing. It's, I'm gonna put this bay leaf in my wallet, or I'm gonna put this clover in my shoe. Like that's a lot of what some of the workings end up as. Some of them are more complicated than that, of course, but a lot of them are really just basic, and I think it's why sometimes people sort of dismiss them.
Yeah, in ceremonial magic, ours are a lot more ornate, but they're typically for slightly different purposes. You can get practical stuff done with ceremonial magic. There are a lot of people who do that. But ceremonial magic isn't entirely practical. There are a lot of workings that are more about like connecting to the divine or to gods or to spirits or whatever, though you can get a lot done if you want to. Our rituals are longer. They tend to follow specific formulas based on either like Hermetic Kabbalah or something else. Like there's typically a reason why we structure things the way we structure them. As well, it's a little less. So when you're new, ceremonial magic can feel like you don't have as much like freedom, or like you don't have as many options or something. Once you get to understand why it works, you have a lot of, you know, room to create your own rituals and create new things. Ceremonial magic workings tend to last longer, and they're very timing specific. So a problem, and something that I think can pull certain people away from ceremonial magic is, and I did a video on this either 1 or 2 videos ago, depending on when this goes up, about like the importance of planetary timing, because when we do, like when you do something in ceremony, can almost be as valuable as the ceremony itself. Though So not all ceremonial magic rituals are like 3-hour-long goetic evocations, right? Like some of them are like the LBRP, which only takes a couple minutes. But yeah, I think one of the big differences is just the length, how often you do them. I think it's easier to get a lot more folk magic done, but folk magic is not easier. That's the thing. Like it's easier to do more of it because it takes less time, because ceremonial magic like can take up a lot of time in your schedule if you're someone who like works or something. But folk magic isn't like easier or lesser. In the past, a lot of ceremonial magicians had this like really horrible and kind of classist attitude about it, but folk magic is not lesser or better. But something I wanted to talk about a little bit is tools. Like, what do you use in your workings? Because I think we probably use pretty different stuff.
So for me, I use, and granted, a lot of this is like, because so much of folk magic is sort of a background for people who are less aware of it, is that it's more about what you have and what's available and what's accessible. So I use a lot of the plants that I found around my area. Like I will pick stuff that's literally growing at the bottom of the stairs of my apartment, or I'll go to some of the local nature trails and pick stuff there. So it's a lot of plant allies, very, very, very heavy influence on what's the word?
Emphasis?
Emphasis. Heavy emphasis on plant allies and candles. Those are like the two big ones for me, although I do a lot of like charm things too. But it's mostly that, some small charm things. I mean, those are my two basic tools really, if I had to put it down to one, because you can do powders and oils and things like that from plants, as well as the plants themselves. Sometimes things like not magic and not work will work their way in. Sigils to a small degree, I'll use some of those. Sometimes writing prayers, petitions, things like that. So some of the more basic-y kind of components that anybody can get, but it's about how you combine them. Although I do also, because I'm an astrologer, but also because it does to a small degree influence into folk magic, I do use planetary timing and like lunar timing. I know that in Ozark folk magic, and I believe Appalachian, but I'd have to re-look at my books, the phase of the moon and what sign the moon is in has a big influence on what you do. So like you plant at this time if it's in this, if the moon is this phase in this sign, that's when you would do a healing working or whatever. Like it does have some influence, but being an astrologer, I look at the planetary timing as like a separate thing from folk magic to put it into my folk magic workings.
Yeah, in general, folk magic and ceremonial magic, you can blend the two. Like,
oh yeah,
I know this video is going to be something titled like, is which one right for you, or versus, but there's no reason you need to choose. As a Thelemite, I believe your true will is not necessarily to do the specific traditional Thelemic rituals, it's whatever your true will says. So incorporating folk magic is totally welcome. Like in the ceremonial space, the tools we kind of use are, you see a lot of daggers, you see lamens, you see chalices. If you've seen the Wiccan altar, a lot of those tools actually come from ceremonial magic, because Wicca has a bit of a history from that tradition. So like we use stuff like that. We do use oils and candles. We don't use as much herbs as you guys use. We use a lot less of them. Though I like personally to use them. I like to dress my candles, but that's not like written into a lot of ceremonial stuff, though it is in some. Like we use different tools. I will say ceremonial magic, I think people think it's a lot more expensive because your upfront cost may be a little higher, but it's really easy to DIY stuff, and a lot of it you only have to buy once. Like you only have to buy your dagger once, you know, like it's not, you're not constantly rebuying in the same way that whenever I was more into folk magic I tended to do, but you still run out of things. And ceremonial magic, traditionally, people would make their own stuff mostly. Now you can buy a lot of it, and there's no shame in buying it. But yeah, so there's... The tool difference is pretty, I'd say, substantial. But there's certain overlaps. We're both using candles. We're both using, like, sigil stuff. We use sigils in a little bit of a different way, but we still use them. Like, you draw a lot of, like, entity sigils, which in my sigil video, I didn't really go through entity sigils. They're a little different than, like, manifestation sigils, but they're pretty similar in how they look and how you, like, create them and stuff. But yeah, our tools vary quite a bit. And I really like to be talking about planetary timing because it shows that like you can customize your practice. If you like certain things from folk magic, like let's say you like working with herbs, you can add those herbs to your ceremony. Or if you like folk magic but like a little things from ceremonial magic, you can add things like doing circles into your folk practice.
Well,
or
something that you sent me that I still use is like a folk how do I put it? Adapted for folk magic, planetary magic, where it's like the planetary squares and the spirit and the intelligence and like the colors and correspondences that go with that, but doing it in sort of more of a folk magic way. And so it's incorporating the planetary magic from ceremonial things and using some of the ceremonial elements, but then sort of not simplifying it, but changing it into a way that looks much more folk and can work for the folk magic. It has worked wonderfully. I do Jupiter stuff for my money altar all the time.
Yeah, like you can mix the two. Once you understand how both systems work, like there's no reason you need to completely separate them. I think that you're gonna have to kind of study them a little separately because a lot of books don't show both, though there are some. But yeah, like you can easily mix them together. I know Wicca is kind of controversial, and I've talked about Wicca in a video, but I think Wicca is actually a good example of this because the Wiccan tradition really comes out of the Golden Dawn and Thelema, but modern Wicca is very more on the folk side of things, but it still has a lot of ceremonial components to it that people do for just like folk style spell work. There's no reason you need to like choose, and as well in things like the Picatrix, which are really associated with ceremonial magic, you see these kind of ideas like doing things on certain, like making oils and making supplies on certain planetary days and seasons and stuff like that, because that's one of the big books that Planetary Magic originally comes from. And you see a lot of stuff like you make oils with this herb on this specific day, which is more folksy if you think about it. It's not a hard dichotomy.
Yeah.
What would be your advice for someone getting into folk magic from either the ceremonial magic side or just new in general?
It's going to be a lot more folklore studying than you think it's going to be. I think that, especially if you're learning online, which, you know, we're assuming maybe you're more online because you're watching this video, I think that the online sphere tends to sort of forget folklore for some reason, and I think it's because we still have sort of this secular mindset about it, where a lot of us come from either like the Christian's perspective or the atheist perspective like I did, and folklore just seems like this dumb thing that, you know, stupid hill folk do. But there's so much wisdom in a lot of folklore where they tell you how to work with things. You know, if there's one from the Ozark book I got recently that I don't remember the entire tale, but part of the story that is told, because it's just like a folk story, a folk tale, this guy is chasing down this raven or this blackbird that is connected to a local witch, and as he's going, he grabs, I think, sassafras for either eyesight or for luck or something. Like it talks about he grabs this plant for this thing, and he does this thing to protect himself. He grabs silver bullets and says these things. And if you look at that folklore, that folktale, it tells you directly, this plant is used for this. You can say this prayer for this thing. Use silver bullets to ward off evil spirits, or just silver in general. Like there's so much you can take from it, and people just sort of forget it because they want it to be somebody directly telling you, if you want to do a protection spell. But more often it's like you hang a horseshoe above your door to protect your family, or like you hang bloodroot above your door to bless your marriage and keep people from interfering. It's just so much more folklore, and people forget that and don't want to look into it because honestly, it's also hard. Like, finding folklore is going to be so varied from country to country. In America, it's region to region, or like what the background is, like the Pennsylvania Dutch powwow tradition versus the Ozarks versus Appalachia versus any of the native traditions versus any of the like southern traditions like hoodoo, conjure, root work, all of that. Like it's going to vary so much. I think it makes it really hard, and people think it's supposed to be really easy.
Yeah, I think one of the big gaps is going to be the regionality aspect, because ceremonial magic is much less localized. And you see people doing ceremonial magic from across the world a little more frequently, and there's a lot less of an emphasis on things like your heritage, your like background and stuff like that. Ceremonial magic, obviously each tradition has influence from the culture it's from, but it's less region specific. Like, you're not going to find different ceremonial magic whether you're in Appalachia or Ozarks or something like that, whereas you will see that with folk magic.
Right.
There's a lot less of that, though there are, you know, different types of ceremonial magic. Looks really different considering what it comes from. Like, medieval Christian ceremonial magic and modern pagan ceremonial magic look radically different, but it's not as like region specific. And ceremonial magic is not, you don't use things like local plants or like local spirits as much, whereas that's really built into a lot of folk magic traditions. You can still do that as a ceremonialist, you absolutely can, but it's less common and less heavily emphasized.
Yeah, I agree, because a lot of the traditions are like, this grows in these mountains, in these hills, this grows in this climate, that's why you use it. So the things that I'm going to have available here and the things that I would use here are not necessarily always going to mesh. Even like with Appalachia, if you're in northern Appalachia versus southern Appalachia, the things you're going to have available to you will still be different. Like, yes, you're still going to be around the mountains or in the mountains, but like down south versus up north, very, very different. Where I am here is going to be very different from somewhere that is because I'm basically on the Mississippi because I'm in Minneapolis. So if you're further down the Mississippi, you're still going to have different plants that I'm going to have. So it's very, very dependent on exactly where you are, because it's about what's available to you. You could order things online. I went out and bought mugwort at a local store here, but you know, mugwort doesn't grow here, or at least not that I'm aware of. I don't know where it actually grows. But, you know, catnip and goldenrod certainly do, so I use those a lot, just as examples.
Yeah, I don't know specifically where mugwort's from, but I know it has to be an old world plant originally because it was called a sailor's tobacco. I believe it can grow in the grow zone of New York City. I know that because people can do it, but I believe it is originally an old world plant that just because it was used as like a substitute smoking base because tobacco, you know, expired easier, so sailors were really into it. So it has to be old world of some variety. But what are some misconceptions you think a ceremonialist would have about folk magic? And I'll give the reverse.
I mean, you already covered it, that there's sort of a classist vibe, that it's easy, that I think sometimes it's like, and they don't say it directly, but there's this vibe that it's for stupid people because they're too dumb to do ceremonial stuff, or they're lazy because, you know, ceremonial stuff takes so much more time, and it's in some ways more complicated, I would argue. Like, I would give that ceremonial as more complicated. So there tends to be this, like, look down your nose, you're stupid and lazy and dumb for doing folk magic, where it's like, it's part of heritage and it's family traditions, and they still work. They work just the same, and I don't fully understand why there is that nose turn, because there's also influence both directions. Folk magic influences ceremonial magic really hardcore.
Yeah, I think that nose down is an attitude we really need to move past, because I think it's got a lot of implications to it, especially because ceremonial magic was historically mostly practiced from like upper class men, whereas folk magic is really associated with women and the working class and stuff like that. So I think that's an attitude us as ceremonialists really do need to work on. I think misconceptions from the folk side towards us is, one, that ceremonial magic has to be expensive. There's certain tools that definitely are, but you can DIY them. I mean, I've heard of people literally doing ceremonial magic in prison with like cups they'll give you and stuff. Like you can DIY a lot and you can make a lot work. You're not limited. There's no requirement to do ceremonial magic. You have to like buy the most expensive stuff. That's a misconception. I think that's what you guys have towards us as well, that we're more armchair magicians and don't do as much or never do practical working. There definitely are armchair magicians, and that's not a good thing, but that's not all of us. That's not all that ceremonial magic is. A lot of us do rituals pretty regularly. Another would be that we're all Christian or Jewish. Pagan ceremonial magic is definitely a thing, like the Greek magical papyri in particular. I don't know. I don't see that one a lot, but I've seen it 1 or 2 times. I think other than that, there's not too many. I think just in general, we should try to learn more about each other, because the thing that's interesting is we end up agreeing on more than we really disagree on. Like, like a lot of the logic for why magic works actually overlaps quite a bit. Like, I think it's closer than people would think it is, and I think we should try to learn from each other. So what are some books you'd recommend, or like resources, and where can we find you?
Resources for folk magic is going to vary a lot based on what tradition you want to go with. I mean, I think in general the PGM is going to be good folk or ceremonial if you want to do Hellenic stuff. Oh god, I don't remember. I recommend all the time, I get the name a little bit wrong, The Way of Fire and Ice or something like that by Ryan Smith for Norse practice. For American practices in particular, I'll talk about Appalachia and Ozark. So, oh god, I don't know his name. Oh god, you'll have to like
Jake Richards?
No, the other one for Ozark.
I'll Google it. I'll figure it out.
There's one that's literally called Ozark Folk Magic. Very, very good. It's pretty much the first result that comes up when you Google it. And Jake Richards, that's an author for Appalachia Folk Magic. He has Backwoods Witchcraft. I think Doctoring Up the Devil.
Doctoring the Devil, yeah.
He also has conjure cards that are out that are really, really cool. Olivia had them when she came here, and they're really cool. So he's a great resource for a lot of that. I think it's really, really excellent. If you want to get more into like timing that is not the Picatrix, you should look into Hellenistic astrology. I think the traditional astrology will appeal more to the ceremonial people, and in general, it's just what I recommend. Demetra George and Chris Brennan are two people who have books. Chris Brennan has a podcast. They are excellent resources for traditional astrology.
Yeah, astrology is actually used quite a bit in ceremonial magic, so we both everyone loves the stars and everyone loves the PGM. If you don't love the PGM, you're wrong.
You are wrong.
I have videos on my channel. You can just click on them for like all my book recommendations for Thelema and ceremonial magic. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, I didn't tell them where to find me.
Oh, right. Yes.
Warrior Witch Nike everywhere. I'm on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. I always forget some. Twitch. I do Twitch streams sometimes. Georgina and I will be streaming together Mondays and Tuesdays.
Yes.
I don't know exactly when we'll start doing them together because I know you're very busy right now.
Soon.
Very soon we'll be doing them together. But I will just be streaming Mondays and Tuesdays.
Probably by the time this video is up.
Probably.
Yeah, something like that. Thank you for watching. You can find me on Patreon for more content. I do extra videos, I do ritual guides, I do a newsletter and all sorts of things. You can also find me on Twitch, Instagram, Twitter. I'm on everywhere except Facebook. And we both host Occultism with a Side of Salt on everywhere podcasts can be found, and on Patreon as well.
And on YouTube.
Yes. So all that will be linked below. Thank you for coming on here and for enjoying my video. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell, and you'll meet your holy guardian angel in 93 days, and you will never need to learn the difference between folk and ceremonial magic.
She's very right.
It's how it works.
It's how it works.
Don't report me to the Better Business Bureau, please. All right, bye.